Few topics spark controversy and debate like immigration. It impacts everything from economics and jobs to culture, even who we are as a nation. So as part of a series exploring opinions on key issues in the U.S., we're taking a closer look at how Americans are thinking about immigration, and not just what they think, but why they think it. So Anthony Salvanto joins me now with what he learned from a new CBS News poll. This is such an interesting way of approaching this topic, Anthony. You found that there are three big picture opinions on immigration policy among Americans. What are they?
Hi, thanks, Anne-Marie, and great to talk to you. Yeah, three big categories here. When you just ask people in general, what should U.S. immigration policy be? And let's put aside the politics and the partisanship that usually goes with this for a second, and you come up with three general responses. One is people who want to stop most or all immigration, and that's about 1 in 5 people in America. And then there's a sort of counterbalance to that. There's people who say, let's allow most or all people who want to enter to come in. And then there's this larger group that I want to talk about first, in the middle, if you will, who say allow some immigration, but based on strict criteria. And that's that 58% right here. Now, one of the things that's important as we talk about each of these segments in turn is a lot of it depends on what they think about immigrants in particular, as well as the impact of immigration. So let me talk about this largest group here for a second, Anne-Marie. How do they describe immigrants? Well, 82% of them describe immigrants as generally hardworking people, as their impact of filling jobs that Americans won't do, said by more than 3/4, how they describe them, and just over 2/3 saying that they're part of what helps make America special. So you see that really positive conception about immigrants in general, and that's associated with that idea of at least allowing some. But let me speak about the criteria, because that's an important part of this too. And they said, well, who should be given priority? And, you know, top of mind in recent news, allowing the Afghan people who helped the U.S. during the war, they get top mention as priority. People who have special work skills. And this is important because they do, although they say they fill jobs Americans won't do, they also feel that it can put pressure on U.S. wages, and so people with special work skills get priority in the eyes of this largest group that would allow some immigration, Anne-Marie.
So what about that other group, that 21%, that say, no, stop all immigration? You know, these immigrants are taking jobs. The country is already full. And even though we know that, you know, that is not the case based on statistics and information, we know that there's plenty of room in this country for new Americans. What's behind that sentiment? Where are people getting that information? You know, why do they feel that way, that immigration needs to come to a grinding halt?
So I'm going to show you this, and it's going to break down into two large factors for that group that says stop. One is going to be culture and impact on what they see as American culture, and the other is going to be economic, and that economic factor is going to be really strong. So let me start with the first of those. The folks who would say stop, you ask, what's the impact of immigration on U.S. society? And they overwhelmingly say right off the bat, it makes it worse. 3/4 say worse, as opposed to even no effect, and very few who say better. Okay, so that's the cultural part of it in part. Then you look at how they describe immigrants, and this is very counter to what we saw in the other group. They describe immigrants as people who are looking for handouts, who take jobs and wages from U.S. citizens. And this is really important because this is a group, and if you look at them demographically, a lot of them don't hold college degrees and may be in jobs or looking for jobs that they feel immigration is putting pressure on the wages or the availability of. And then look at the contrast there on that very point, that fewer of them say that they fill jobs that Americans won't do. So that economic factor is really important. And then I would add this. When you ask people, well, if there is immigration, should it be increased, decreased, stop, from which regions of the world? And these folks are more likely to say that it should be stopped or decreased from places like the Middle East and Latin America than it should be from Europe. these folks, too, I would add, are people who, when they asked about their own families and their own ancestry, are more inclined to say that their families have always been or have been in the U.S. for a very long time, as opposed to having immigrants in their more recent generations, Anne-Marie.
Right, that sort of makes sense. And then you have sort of the people on the other end of the spectrum that are saying more immigration. Let's expand immigration. What's behind their feelings?
Well, these folks, first of all, start by saying their views are motivated by what they see as principle about what the U.S. stands for. And they're much less likely to say that their opinions are motivated by jobs in the U.S. job market. Part of that may be that demographically, they are sort of the opposite. They're more likely to be college degree holding. They're more likely to be younger. And as we know in the U.S., younger generations are more diverse. And so that's part of what drives them. And then they say, well, for them, priority ought to be given to people who are fleeing persecution elsewhere, people who are seeking asylum. And that connects with that idea, like I said at the top, that they see this in principle about letting folks in who are under these kinds of circumstances, and also those with family in the U.S. So there's a less of an economic factor for them, and they see it more as an ability to help, or what the U.S. stands for in terms of letting in people under those kinds of dire circumstances, Anne-Marie.
So, Anthony, forgive me for sort of throwing a question at you that you may not have even asked in the polling, but I'm curious as to where people get their information about immigrants and immigration, because I can see clearly that some of it comes from sort of news headlines, because there's talk of the Afghans who helped the American military. Some of it comes from personal stories, perhaps if you have had an immigrant in your family, or even if it's several generations back. But were you able to ask people where do they get their information from?
And part of that is your own personal experience too, because we also asked people, what about your area? And what has been the effect and what has been the change there from immigration? And what you see is that people say, based on their own ideas of what immigrants do, whether their area has been made better or made more difficult by immigration. So part of it is that personal experience. And look, we know from other surveys and we know from other studies that the source of information is often chosen by things that people say are going to be, or think are going to be, confirmatory with their often existing views about what's going on. So there's a bit of a feedback loop there oftentimes. And I would add this too, that I'll show you this last slide. One thing that does connect everybody, that goes through all these groups, is that they feel that people who do immigrate should go through whatever the U.S. legal process is. And that's a kind of connective thread between all of these, with that very large number who feel that way.
All right, that makes sense. Anthony Salvanto, thank you so much.
Thank you.